The first question you need to answer for your investment real estate on this episode of the 1031 Show.
I'm Alex Stavorowski.
And I'm Wally Smith, founder and CEO of Ridgegate Financial and Impact 1031.
Over the last few years, we've talked with thousands of real estate investors dealing with the same problems we'll discuss today.
Now, let's talk about the first question you need to answer for your investment real estate. The question is, what are you actually trying to accomplish with your investment real estate? Or stated another way, what's the problem you're trying to solve? It might sound simple, and it is, but in reality, it can get complicated pretty quickly.
Well, it's like when you're climbing a mountain and you know the phenomenon of the false summit. When you're on your way up the mountain and you can see the top or what you think might be the top, but just as you're getting there, the last couple steps that you're taking, you realize that what looked like the top was just obscuring the actual summit that you were pursuing along the way. It's a false summit where you think you've made it, but then you realize that you still have a lot more work to do. And answering this question, what are you actually trying to accomplish with your investment real estate, can be just as tricky.
You know, the false summit really is something that we encounter. You kind of lose track of your ultimate goal, and then you achieve something, you say, wow, where am I really going? And we find that happens a lot with, especially with the investment real estate. It's such a long-term hold, such a long-term commitment. Let's go through a couple of cases, and maybe that can shed some light on it for people. So one of the examples is a fellow who came to us. He said, I need to consolidate my properties into a bigger property. I think this example is going to be relevant to investors who own several or even dozens of properties and are thinking about consolidating all that asset value into a bigger property, and they're thinking that's going to make it easier to manage for them. This particular real estate investor had more than 100 doors, and combined they were worth mid eight figures. It was a pretty good investment for the family. We talked to him about why did they get into real estate in the first place. It was kind of an accidental thing. Dad had been into it. He inherited a few properties or partnered with his father in them, and things just kind of grew. They had a great eye for the area. They lived in the area for a long time, so they knew where the trends were, what was where the population was moving, what were busy corners, and they had a really good sense for the right properties to buy. So we asked him, what is he really trying to achieve in our first conversation, and really was trying to find a way to make it easier to manage all these properties. And they thought consolidation was going to be a way to do that. And so that was really a start of the false summit that you mentioned earlier. Really thinking that you know what you're trying to do, but realizing it only looks like that's the problem. That's not really the problem they're trying to solve. So our framework, which we always go through in these exercises, is it's purpose, planning, and portfolio. The purpose has to be the beginning of the framework, and ask yourself, what are you trying to achieve? When you think you think about that answer, and then see if you can ask yourself why. Okay, why do I think that's what I'm trying to achieve? In this case, it was, the purpose is to try to consolidate. If you can ask that question and there is an answer, then repeat it and say why to that question. You're going to keep repeating that. That's our framework. Keep repeating that to drill down on what ultimately is the purpose. It's not really a new concept or a new way of trying to figure things out. Aristotle talked about a similar process in trying to figure out what is the good in anything or anyone for that matter. He says that everything has some higher good that it seeks until finally reaching that good for its own sake, just the enjoyment of the thing itself. So a false summit looks like this. I want to do XYZ. I want to do such and such. A true summit or the highest good looks like I want to do XYZ because that's what I enjoy spending my time doing, and that's what I find most fulfilling. So this is roughly a third of being able to answer this most important question. I'll come back to it in just a minute when we get back to our example.
So when you have that thing identified, then comes the planning portion of the framework. You start by looking at all the constraints and figuring out the different ways that you might actually go about pursuing that purpose. Finding that true summit or the actual problem you're trying to solve then leads into what's the best way to get there. And to do that, you really have to think outside the box. And as professionals, not accepting what somebody comes in with as the plan as the only way to do it. So is there another way to do it? What might that look like? And if there are no constraints, what would the ideal path be for that individual? After that, we're looking at assembling and executing the strategies on a portfolio level necessary to support the plan and pursue that purpose.
So let's go back to the example of the man I mentioned with the portfolio of more than 100 doors worth mid 8 figures. So we start with a framework with purpose. He first came to us saying, I need to sell some of these properties. I want to consolidate them, do a 1031 exchange. He really thought that was the goal, the problem to solve, or his summit. We asked him, we said, well, okay, great. What are you trying to accomplish by doing this? He said, well, I want to be able to have easier management of my whole investment portfolio. We asked him, that sounds good. Why do you want it to be easier management? So you see, successively asking why. He said, I guess there are other things I would like to spend my time doing. We said, fair enough. What kind of things? He said, well, I don't know exactly. Travel, I suppose, some other things. We continued the conversation, and I said, tell me what got you into real estate in the first place? He said, well, he wanted to have a life that was better than what he could achieve just by working a job, being captive to that job, having a 401k savings, for example. He said he wanted to be able to travel, send his kids to good schools, things like that. So now his kids have already gone through school. The next question was a little bit more specific. Said, well, now that your kids are grown and are actually doing pretty well financially, what does that look like now? He thought for a minute, and he talked about some specific legacy goals now for his kids and grandkids. He wanted to achieve those in addition to the travel, daily lifestyle elements, things that were being derailed by the time that the property management took. So I knew we were about a third of the way through. We knew what he was actually trying to achieve. Doing a 1031 exchange really was just something to facilitate. What he's really trying to achieve is the true summit, is what we're trying to find. Mentioned earlier that when we were talking about Aristotle, that come back to the second part of answering this question, and when do you want to achieve this thing or solve this problem?
And this is a really important part, and it was really important for this client, not just the what, but the when. We asked him, do you see yourself still actively managing these properties 10 years from now? He thought about it for a second, and he said, no way. I'm in my mid-60s. I hope I'm not still doing this every day 10 years from now. And the next question from there was, well, when would you like to make this shift and start pursuing this higher purpose? He said, let's get started right now. Mm-hmm. Finally, we could approach the third part of answering that question, which is how do you want to get there? So the what, the when have been answered, and now we're looking at how. And this is important because how you travel down the road on the journey, the planning, all of that comes into play is very important to some people. It makes a difference. This client could have wrapped up 100 plus doors and done a portfolio sale and been done with the transition almost immediately, but that would have affected the valuation, so that how became an important factor in the planning and figuring out what kind of recommendations we should be making. And now we had a full answer to the question. The what, the when, and the how were answered for his true summit, and we identified the purpose to move into the planning stage from there.
Right. So with planning, we asked what strategies and avenues do we have to pursue this goal, and that's really where the industry expertise comes in, the planning expertise. And so with many properties, there are a bunch of different ways, permutations, different strategies that we could accomplish that. In addition to all of the properties, he also has some other assets. And it's interesting, real estate people are different. When we asked him about his assets, everything he talked about was his real estate property, and then it was, by the way, we had to drill down on it, ask about traditional investments, and he was like, oh yeah, I've got some of that stuff. And the stuff that he had was actually significant. It wasn't insignificant, but it wasn't what his focus was on. His focus was on the real estate. His first thoughts were on right track and doing a series of 1031 exchanges that really fit in with his purpose. But the way he originally identified, there were some serious problems, and it resulted in his managing the properties actively. We asked ourselves whether the strategy was the only way or whether it was the best way for his purpose. And his answer was an emphatic no. Was not the best way. So instead, we designed a series of strategic exchanges into exchange-friendly investments that are structured so really give a potential for completely hands-off passive income. That's what we find most people are wanting when they come to us. So that really brought us to the portfolio section of the framework. With so many properties, so many different moving parts, a strategy like we designed, it can take some time, requires systematic movement of the assets around. For example, if you have several assets that sell in close time proximity to each other, you could roll those into one exchange, as an example. But with so much complexity, following this framework really helped them for the first time in 30 years. First time actually have a overall comprehensive handle on the properties they had, the ownership, the goals for each one, all the statistics, everything. We were able to give him, for the first time ever, a real picture of what he has, and then from that being able to do the planning for what the ultimate portfolio would be for him that's going to serve his purpose. So that was a fun engagement. It was a big engagement because there were a lot of different parts to it. It's ongoing. It's going to take years to unwind his whole portfolio, but he's already benefiting. He's already feeling the freedom from executing the framework. And of course, every situation, every case is different. The market, the timing, the products, the solutions, everything we can put him into. This is specific to this particular investor, and any individual who we analyze, anybody who we will work with, they're going to have their own circumstances. So, and the varying degrees of success, all of that's dependent. It's a case-by-case basis.
And again, that framework is so important, the purpose planning portfolio, and it's not that we're helping people to fully achieve that true summit overnight, but for the first time, they're actually going to see what they're working towards. They're going to see that true summit. And like you said, for that individual, it was still going to be a hard climb. There was a lot of work to be done, but he wasn't on the wrong path anymore.
That's right. So, Alex, that was a lot of fun. That was a great case. And like I said, it's ongoing. And it's such a pleasure to work with this family, too, and knowing that the impact we're making is going to be felt for generations. That's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Speaking of generations and legacy, I know you had a case that we worked on that was some brothers with some legacy property. Can you tell us how you applied the framework to that?
The situation they came in with was, I own property with other people, and we think we all have to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. We may not want to, but that's what we've been told. We have to do the same thing.
That's very common.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this example, I think, is going to be really relevant because of how common it is to all of the investors that own property with multiple other owners. Typically within a couple different structures, whether that's trusts, LLCs, partnerships, whatever it might look like. But when they're thinking about selling the properties or transitioning into something else, everyone's thinking that they have to be on the same page if they want to move forward. And with the three brothers, the situation there was that they'd inherited property from their parents. The parents were gone. Three brothers were left as equal owners of this property that was held in an LLC. And they wanted to be good stewards of the parents' legacy, or, well, at least one of the brothers did. But not all of the brothers wanted the same thing. Yep. So two of the brothers wanted to sell, pay the taxes, take the cash, and go spend. The third brother was more interested in why the parents had set things up the way they did, continuing that legacy for generations to come. And in this case, that's where we saw, in talking with him, the false summit start to emerge, is I have to do the same things even though it's not what I want to do. And so he was on a path he didn't want to be on in the first place, but thought that the summit was the only option he had available. So again, with the purpose part of the framework, figuring out the why, asking the why questions, which we often see are questions that not only has an advisor or planner or somebody never asked this individual, but they haven't really asked it of themselves. Why am I trying to do this? What am I trying to achieve? And all of the layers that go into that. And we often find when we're trying to unfocus from the false summit and find the true summit, that the whys and the purpose behind it go well beyond the investment, well beyond the real estate itself. But like you said, with the family dynamics, I want to be able to do what I want, but I don't want to compromise my relationship with my brothers, and I don't want to cause division within the family. It's not that important to me, but these two things don't seem to be able to be true at the same time. So figuring out the why, digging into the purpose, is such an important first step in the framework, because that ultimately is going to allow us to do the planning from there. The planning being informed by the purpose, but if we've only ever figured out that their purpose is on the surface level of doing something with the real estate and getting the property sold, then we're not doing the job that we need to actually help them and actually help these individuals and make sure that all of their reasons for doing it are accounted for, making sure the brothers are all happy with one another, for example. Well, and just like the first case we discussed today, the asking why is so important, because if you can ask why and have an answer to that question, then you probably need to keep digging, because you haven't found that true summit. You haven't found the highest purpose for what's trying to be achieved. And a lot of people don't dig deep enough to figure out what it might be and keep asking those questions. They'll assume they know what the purpose is, and then move forward from there into the planning, and they're off from the start. So we need to set up the purpose to be exactly where we need to start, and then work into the planning, because we're going to ask the same kinds of questions. Is this the only way to do it? What are the other ways? If there were no constraints, what's the ideal path forward? And putting together a realistic plan based on that purpose is the only way we can move forward into the portfolio level and assembling those specific strategies necessary to achieve the plan and the purpose.
So in this case, we started with the brothers talking about their purpose. One of the brothers really wanted to do a 1031 exchange, and we said, why? He said, well, he wants to keep the money in real estate. He recognized they didn't want to lose value by paying the taxes when they sell. And it's interesting, he's very entrepreneurial, so he had the ability to create money. He didn't look at this as a once-in-a-lifetime thing that I've got to get access to this right now. He looked at it more as from a position of stewardship. And when we asked him about that, why do you want to avoid losing taxes, he immediately brought up stewardship and feeling that his parents had left them a legacy. They wanted to continue to leave a legacy for generations to come. We continue saying, well, why haven't you done this already for the properties that you sold previously? Because this wasn't the first one for them to sell. And he said it was more trouble to try to convince the brothers. They weren't concerned about the legacy. And, I think it wasn't that they weren't concerned as much as that it wasn't important to them. They thought about it. If somebody had asked them, do you want to leave money for your heirs? Their response most likely would have been, well, if there is anything, we want to be able to take care of ourselves first. So it's really different mindset. So the how of it was very important, as far as each of the brothers had a different answer as to what do they want to do with it, when do they want to do it, but somehow they all felt that they had to have the same how. So that was the fall summit, feeling like, okay, we all have to do a 1031 exchange with this. And that's really where it took us to the planning.
And that's such an important piece of looking at the fall summit in context of the what, the when, and the how, is there can be many fall summits across those three categories. And for them, thinking they were all on the same page with the how, or had to be on the same page, really was the primary focus. But when we started looking at the true purpose of what they were trying to achieve, then the planning came into play to allow them to realize the how could be different, and how they got to their true summit individually didn't have to be something that caused a lot of tension or issues with the brother. And when we look at the brother trying to do a 1031, there are restrictions around properties being sold as far as maintaining the taxable entity ownership of the property sold, the property being replaced, which is generally where this thought comes from of, well, we're in an LLC together. The LLC has to sell the property, so the LLC has to buy the property on the replacement side, and you can't just dissolve that right before doing an exchange or selling a property and make it work. The IRS kind of frowns upon that, because it's what you call a drop and swap, where ownership is changing immediately before a sale, and things are then moving around and not being consistent and maintaining that continuity of ownership.
Well, and that's true. I mean, the IRS with a 1031 exchange, which is what they came in asking about, part of that rule says that you're buying to invest and hold a property for business purposes.
Right.
And so holding it for, if you changed ownership, then the new owner would have, if you did it right before sale, that new owner could have held it for a few days or a few weeks. And then it's not holding it for business purposes. That would be clearly often looked at as a tax avoidance reason instead of owning it for business purposes.
And with that in mind, that's why we're going to recommend ideally 2, but at the very least 1 tax cycle showing a specific ownership before a property is sold.
Mm-hmm.
But when one of the brothers came to us and said we're selling in 30 days, obviously they don't have 2
Right.
years to let that mature.
Well, and the topic of a drop and swap is not a bad thing on its own. It has to do when it's in close time proximity to the sale.
Right. Yeah, immediately prior to trying to sell and change ownership, because we've decided not everybody wants to do the same thing, but the property is selling.
Right. So when we counsel people in the planning aspects of it, if they're going to change something, we like to look at a portfolio and say, well, over the next few years, this is what you're going to do. So then is the structure, titling, and ownership optimal for that? And that's where we might say, well, let's drop the current structure and swap, and well before we swap the property.
Right.
So it's an important technicality, but a very important one.
Right. And that's part of where our consulting comes in with building out a plan 1 to 2 years in advance. People realize owning real estate that these things don't really happen overnight. So they call us and talk with us about the situation and what they're trying to achieve, and we go through the framework and we figure out the purpose. But a longer-term plan allows us to do consulting in the meantime to make sure that they're set up to take those steps when the time comes, and they're not looking at a situation 30 days prior to a sale where they haven't done any of this and they have no options from there.
Right. Well, I think that's one of the valuable services is consulting and being able to step back. It's not a matter of somebody call us and say, hey, I've got a transaction to do. No, we actually prefer to be brought in and say, well, let's help with an overall strategy. What are we trying to do? And that's really the planning part of our purpose planning portfolio, our federal trademark.
Right. Well, a lot of people call in thinking that they just want some education. They just need to learn about this so that they can do it when the time comes. But we talk them through the fact that a lot of these things do need to be set up 1 to 2 years in advance. So not only are we educating and sharing the expertise that we have, but allowing them to establish a plan to look towards the long term for what they're trying to accomplish.
Right. And we can talk to people and educate them. In fact, our academy, our free services that we have online can provide a lot of the education. But when it really comes down to, well, these are my properties, here's my tax return, here's my Schedule E, these are all of the players, that's where the consulting comes into
Right.
play.
But that being said, with this situation with the brothers being in a short-term window of needing to do something, there are tools that we can use to restructure ownership, maintaining the continuity of ownership to allow a 1031 to happen, and allowing the other brothers to sell out and do what they want.
Right. So there ultimately are ways, even if it is a very short time before an exchange is done, to be able to accomplish that. So part of the framework, part of the planning is who are the players, what are the assets, what is the purpose, what does everybody want to achieve individually out of this transaction.
Right.
And then we look at it and say, well, maybe a 1031 across the board, maybe it's a combination of things. And that's really where having the tax counsel, the legal counsel, and the experience to be able to do that. It's you know, if you go on and you Google 1031 exchange, you end up with 25 million hits
At least.
So that's where we really enjoy being able to sort through all that noise, get right to the signal. What are we trying to do for them?
Absolutely. And from there, it's just the portfolio level of we figured out the plan, we figured out the best way to execute towards the purpose, and implementing the portfolio solutions comes naturally.
Our big takeaway from today's show is that answering the one question is the first step towards executing the framework with the goal of helping your investment real estate to strive towards accomplishing your purpose.
Right. That question of what am I actually trying to accomplish, or what is the real problem that I'm trying to solve, not just what's the problem that I think I'm trying to solve. You ask the why, so you get down to the true problem.
And, it can be easy to think that you know the answer to that question, but it's very common to have these false summits to where you identify something that, well, that's what I need to do, but that's really only a step along the way.
The what, the when, the how, all of those false summits can come into what somebody thinks might be the best plan, and then we talk them through by taking a step back to, okay, hold on. Let's actually figure out what you're trying to achieve and make sure that you're looking at the true summit for any of these avenues.
Mm-hmm. So once you answer that question, the pathway to solving the rest of it is much clearer. If you want help answering that question yourself, or personalizing our framework for finding your purpose, or for organizing your real estate investments to pursue that purpose, the best way to start is by scheduling a call with our team. I'll put a link in the description. You'll also find some other resources there as well. So until next time, I'm Wally Smith.
And I'm Alex Dabrowski.
And this is the 1031 Show.
Impact 1031 is a DBA of Ridgegate Financial, LLC. Not an offer to buy nor a solicitation to sell securities. All investing involves risk. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Speak to your finance and/or tax professional prior to investing. Securities offered through Emerson Equity, LLC. Member FINRA SIPC. Only available in states where Emerson Equity, LLC is registered. Emerson Equity, LLC is not affiliated with any other entities identified in this communication. Investment advisory services offered through AD Wealth Management. Emerson Equity, Ridgegate Financial, and AD Wealth Management are not affiliated entities.